이제 메인 기조 강연 순서입니다. 기조 강연을 해주실 타일러 스토벌 캘리포니아 주립대학 교수님은 역사학 분야에서 탁월한 업적을 내신 학자로서 본 대학의 인문대학장을 역임하셨고 미국 역사협회 회장님도 역임하셨습니다. 전공 분야는 근대 및 20세기 프랑스사입니다. 주요 저서로는 파리의 누아, 빛의 도시에서의 흑인들, 초국가적인 프랑스, 보편적인 국가의 근대 역사 등 다수의 책을 집필하셨을 뿐 아니라 주제와 관련된 여러 저서의 편집도 맡고 계십니다. 현재는 자유와 인종 문제에 초점을 둔 세계사, 백인의 자유, 사상의 인종사를 집필 중이신데요. 프린스턴 대학 출판부에서 곧 발간될 예정입니다. 그럼 타일러 스토벌 교수님을 무대로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for coming to this conference. I would like to first of all thank the organizers of the 5th World Humanities Forum. I would like to thank Professor Chong-Soo Kim and especially Sandy Choi for her constant emails and staying on top of a rather disorganized academic like myself. So thank you all. This is a wonderful opportunity for me. It's my first trip to Korea, and I hope it will not be my last. So, I wanted to just dive right in. This paper is part of a larger project, as you heard, about the relationship between freedom and race in the modern world. It tends to focus on two countries, on France, the country that I've studied, and on the United States, the country where I was born, but it also has pretensions to being a world history. So, according to a persistent rumor among African Americans, in the sculpture that rises grandly from, let's see, sorry, just, how do I move the images forward? Okay, okay. So just hit this. There we go. Okay. According to a persistent rumor among African Americans, the sculpture that rises grandly from Liberty Island in New York Harbor is not the original Statue of Liberty. The true original was modeled after a black woman and had African features. In addition, the point of the statue was not to honor immigrants, but rather the abolition of slavery in America by the Civil War. The statue on the left, by the way, is a real statue. It stands on the French island of Saint Martin in the Caribbean. But rather to honor the abolition of slavery in America by the Civil War, in particular the service of black Union soldiers. The statue carried broken chains to symbolize emancipation. Furthermore, the legend goes, the current white statue was substituted for the original when American politicians objected to portraying liberty as a black woman. Some have even argued that the original black statue still exists, either in France or hidden somewhere in the catacombs of New York. No evidence exists to verify this legend, but its mere existence underscores the racialized nature of America's most famous monument. Of all memorials to freedom throughout the world, none is more important or more widely known than the Statue of Liberty. Towering majestically over the entrance to New York Harbor since 1886, the great statue has become more than any other monument or physical site the symbol of both human freedom and American national identity. Originally a gift from France to the United States, it also represents the historical ties between the two great republics and the significance of liberty as a global phenomenon. Endlessly reproduced as a tourist object, commercial symbol, and political icon, the Statue of Liberty is one of the great monuments of the modern world. Today I wish to consider a little explored aspect of the Statue of Liberty's history, its role as a symbol of whiteness, and more particularly of the whiteness of freedom. In general, I contend that race and racism are not just central aspects of Western society, but they have shaped and permeated the very idea of freedom as we understand it. Moreover, freedom has been closely entangled with ideas of whiteness and white racial identity in modern history, so that to be free has often meant to be white and vice versa. The Statue of Liberty symbolizes this perfectly, most obviously the statue's European physical features, but also the lack, indeed, as we shall see, the suppression of any markers identifying it with rebel or freed slaves, give it a strong sense of racial identity. Moreover, the symbolic role played by the Statue of Liberty in allowing European immigrants to the United States to claim white status underscores its racial character, as does its complicated but largely exclusionary or at best irrelevant relationship to African Americans and other peoples of color. In particular, the Statue of Liberty embodies both racial difference as well as an unparalleled representation of human liberation. It is thus the perfect symbol of white freedom. Now, the first section I want to talk about Republican freedom, the ideal of Republican freedom in France. Conceived by French scholar and activist Edouard de Laboulaye and wrought by French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, the Statue of Liberty represents not only the admiration of the people of France for America, but equally illustrates the changing nature of liberty, including its racial dimensions in French history. The idea of France as a land of freedom has been central to modern French identity, summarized by the famous slogan of the French Revolution, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, in which liberty takes pride of place. In particular, the ideal of freedom has taken the political form of republicanism, emphasizing popular sovereignty and the rejection of aristocratic rule. Emerging out of the cauldron of the French Revolution, republicanism espoused a new vision of France, and indeed of all humanity, centered around individual liberty and political democracy. Throughout the 19th century, republicanism in France struggled with its revolutionary heritage. At the base of the turmoil was the core tension between republicanism and liberalism, between the emphasis on democracy and the stress on individual freedom. Not for nothing did the liberal prime minister of the July monarchy, François Guizot, scornfully dismiss those campaigning for universal suffrage by saying that if they wanted to vote, they should get rich. How could the radical vision of democracy championed by the Jacobin Republic and the sans-culottes of the French Revolution coexist with property rights, the rule of law, and civil liberties? The contrast between these two visions of republicanism formed part of the broader struggle throughout Europe and beyond to reconcile popular sovereignty and private property, one that would ultimately create the powerful compromise we know as liberal democracy. In order for republicanism to win the allegiance of the affluent bourgeoisie in particular, and the majority of the French population in general, it ultimately had to shed its revolutionary trappings and come to terms with the nation's established order. The idea of the Statue of Liberty took shape in this France racked by empire, republicanism, and revolution. The life and politics of Edouard de Laboulaye, the man who more than any other conceived of the idea, illustrates the ways in which the political turbulence of mid-19th century France shaped the statue that would come to dominate New York Harbor. An ardent Republican whose hero was the Marquis de Lafayette, Laboulaye was in his early 40s when Louis Napoleon smashed the French Republic, replacing it with the Second Empire. Bitterly disappointed by this new turn to despotism in France, Laboulaye focused on the United States as a successful example of Republican government and popular sovereignty. A professor of law at Paris's prestigious Collège de France, he became one of the nation's first and foremost specialists in the study of the United States. Like a fellow Frenchman he greatly admired, Alexis de Tocqueville, Laboulaye saw in the United States a successful example of moderate and stable republicanism that could serve as a model for France and the rest of the world. The 1865 triumph of the North in the American Civil War was followed 5 years later by the collapse of the Second Empire in France and the advent of the Third Republic. The defeat of the Confederacy removed Laboulaye's one major criticism of the United States, slavery. Like many French liberals, a strong abolitionist, Laboulaye has struggled to understand how a regime as noble as the American Republic could tolerate such an abomination against human rights. For Laboulaye, the Civil War and the emancipation of American slaves reaffirmed his faith in that nation's Republican vision. The overthrow of the Second Empire brought the end of a regime that had antagonized the United States and made France once again a republic. As a result, Laboulaye ardently hoped for an alliance of the two great sister republics, one that would bring liberty and enlightenment to all the peoples of the world. By the beginning of the 1870s, Laboulaye had developed the idea of a giant statue symbolizing liberty that France would give to the United States in honor of the centennial of the American Revolution. At the end of the 1860s, he met Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, an ambitious young French sculptor devoted to monumental public art who would make his vision a reality. Most important, the image of a female colossus symbolized the liberty and progress inspired Bartholdi's creation of the American statue. Now, why would one give the ideal of liberty a female form? There is a long history of female representations of nations and political ideas, one which, as many feminists have trenchantly noted, has often coincided with the political exclusion and suppression of women in real political life. The ancient Romans celebrated the god Libertas, and during the early modern era in Europe, the idea of freedom as a woman challenged the masculine authority of kings. The French Revolution gave birth to the idea of Marianne as the great symbol of the Republic, and throughout the modern era, she has represented both republicanism and liberalism in modern France. No painting of modern liberty is better known or more powerful than Eugène Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Created in the year that the 1830 revolution overthrew the Restoration monarchy, Delacroix's great work portrays liberty as a powerful woman, armed and bare-breasted, leading the insurgents of Paris in the fight for freedom. In my analysis, Marianne is the direct ancestor of the Statue of Liberty. But the American monument incorporated some very important changes, symbolizing a different vision of freedom. Most notably, the classic image of Marianne united republicanism and revolution, emphasizing the overthrow of oppression. Key to this vision was the presence on so many Mariannes of the Phrygian cap, and that is the cap that she is wearing on top of her head, the ancient Roman symbol of the freed slave. Throughout the modern era in Europe, as the Marseillaise, the French national anthem itself demonstrates, the struggle against monarchism and capitalism often adopted the metaphor of the slave uprising. Marianne thus represented not just resistance to oppression, but more specifically, freedom as the end of slavery. As in Delacroix's painting, many Mariannes also wore weapons, emphasizing that the fight for liberty was a violent struggle. Finally, although not in this painting, Marianne often bore a torch of some sort, symbolizing both illumination or enlightenment and the fires of revolution. One of the most dramatic, and for its opponents horrific, images of the Paris Commune, the revolution that briefly overthrew the French government in 1871, was the pétroleuse, or female incendiary. Persistent rumors suggested that working-class Parisian women would fill empty bottles with gasoline and use these homemade bombs to attack the forces of order and set fires throughout the city. So this is one drawing of the female incendiary during the Paris Commune. The pétroleuse was Delacroix's liberty come to life, a revolutionary woman holding a flame in her hand. She symbolized everything bad about republicanism, and the French troops that suppressed the Commune summarily executed women throughout the city suspected of being pétroleuses. Oftentimes they were women just carrying milk bottles. The new Third Republic sought to craft a more peaceful, less revolutionary image of Marianne after 1870. Like the Second Empire before it, it sought to ban the Phrygian cap as part of this symbol. More important for the purposes of this study, the turmoil of the 1870 revolution and the Paris Commune reinforced the belief of Laboulaye and Bartholdi in moderate republicanism and the need to represent it in monumental symbolic form. For them, the French Civil War underscored the dangers of the Revolutionary Republic, which must be suppressed symbolically as well as in actual combat. Their vision of the Statue of Liberty consequently emphasized freedom's moderate virtue. The statue is fully clothed, both majestic and modest, unlike the radical women of Paris. It also does not bear a Phrygian cap. As we shall see, the suppression of any links with anti-slavery also had an important American dimension, but in the French context, it represented the rejection of freedom as insurrection, so violently embodied by the Paris Commune. In addition, the Statue of Liberty's torch is carefully contained, a light and not a fire, or as Laboulaye put it, a torch and not a flame, to illuminate, not destroy. The French vision of the Statue of Liberty thus represented a domesticated version of the pétroleuse, weaponless and shorn of all revolutionary intent. The evolution of the image of Marianne and the contest between moderate and radical visions of republicanism formed part of the struggles around social class that so profoundly shaped politics and society in 19th century France. At times, conflicts based in social class and class ideologies had an important racial dimension. Differences of race and class have often interacted in modern history, so that working class Europeans have frequently been racialized as other. During the 19th century, many leftists portrayed workers as slaves and their struggles as a kind of slave uprising. Karl Marx himself called the Paris Commune a revolt against, quote, the would-be slaveholders of France, and compared it to the American Civil War. Others considered the communards savages, viewing them and Parisian workers in general as unfit for civilization and liberty. For Count Arthur de Gobineau, France's most prominent racial theorist in the mid-19th century, the Commune and French workers in general represented racial degeneration and debasement analogous to blacks and other peoples of color. Perhaps most important, the triumph of bourgeois republicanism in France coincided with imperial expansion overseas. It is one of the ironies of French history that the republic which overthrew the Second Empire would foster the nation's greatest period of imperial expansion. The Third Republic created a massive new empire, expanding and consolidating colonies in Africa, Indochina, and the Pacific, and it did so in the name of republicanism. It presented the strange contradiction of a republican empire without an emperor. The essence of this contradiction was, of course, racial difference, so that Republican France became an empire of black and brown natives ruled over by white citizens. The great statue France bequeathed to the United States in 1886 was therefore far more than a straightforward symbol of liberty. It represented changing views of republicanism and freedom in general in France during the 19th century. In particular, it underscored the triumph of a new view of freedom, one which increasingly rejected the concepts of more radical history in favor of the rule of law and respect for the rights of property. This bourgeois vision of liberty also had a significant racial component, especially noteworthy because the Third Republic would not only emphasize conservative republicanism, but also go on to create the greatest overseas empire in French history. When liberty came to America's shores, this racial dimension already prefigured in France would become more important than ever. Now I want to talk about the transition to the United States. The America that welcomed the Statue of Liberty stood poised on the edge of global prominence, while at the same time haunted by the shadows of the recent Civil War. To an even greater extent than in the case of France, the political life of the United States centered around republicanism. America had always been a republic. As in France, however, there were different visions of republicanism. America also faced a choice between more and less inclusive visions of the republic, radical versus conservative republicanism. In America, the key issue dividing Republicans, which is to say political thinkers in general, was slavery, and behind it, racial difference. Unlike France, the United States began not just as a republic, but as a slave republic, and the intimate entanglement of freedom and race lay at the heart of American experience from the beginning. The 1790 Alien Naturalization Act limited citizenship to whites, a legal tradition reinforced by the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which held that even free blacks could not be U.S. citizens. The conflict over slavery led directly to the Civil War, the greatest military conflict in American history. The importance of this war to American history cannot be overstated, but most notably for our purposes, In abolishing slavery and making the freed slaves American citizens, the victory of the Union spelled the end of the white republic. Or did it? The Republican Party had been founded in 1854 as a political movement opposed to slavery, yet as became clear, such opposition could take different forms. For many, including the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, opposition to slavery meant hostility to the presence of blacks, slave or free, on American soil. The Republic must reject slavery, but the best way to do that was to get rid of the slaves themselves. By 1865, the Republicans were clearly divided as to how to rebuild a bitterly divided nation, but more generally, about the shape of the American future. Moderate Republicans, like Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, wanted not only to reconcile with the defeated South, but also to prevent social or political equality for African Americans. In contrast, the radical Republicans insisted on a thoroughgoing political overhaul of the South, one that would give the freedmen full status as American citizens based on the principle that all Americans were equal regardless of race. The conflict between these two perspectives haunted the Reconstruction era and ultimately brought it to its end. 1877, the year that saw the triumph of the moderate Republic in France, also witnessed the end of radical Republican Reconstruction in the United States. In 1876, the moderate Republican Rutherford B. Hayes won a very closely contested presidential election, partly on his promise to stop meddling in the affairs of the South. After he won, he honored his promise to Southern Democrats by agreeing to withdraw federal troops from the region, a promise he kept in 1877. With their departure, little prevented white Democrats and the racist terrorists who supported them from ending Reconstruction and the promise of an egalitarian republic. By the first decade of the 20th century, blacks had been effectively disenfranchised throughout the South. White supremacy had destroyed Reconstruction and the dream of an inclusive republic. The end of Reconstruction was perhaps the most obvious example of the increasingly racialized nature of American republicanism in the late 19th century. In 1882, little more than a decade after laborers from China had helped build the nation's first transcontinental railroad, America passed the first of several Chinese exclusion acts, making it a crime for workers to immigrate from the United States to the United States from China. The decades after the Civil War also witnessed the final stages of the American wars against Native Americans in the Great Plains, culminating with the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. The nation that welcomed the Statue of Liberty in 1886 was thus one that had embraced its own version of conservative republicanism, one even more than in France, grounded in racial difference. The image of a Marianne shorn of references to insurgent politics found a ready audience in America. Correspondingly, while Laboulaye and Bartholdi personally supported the abolitionist cause, they designed the statue not to irritate what had increasingly become a sore subject in the United States. During his tour of the U.S. to explore support for the statue, the new political context became clear to Auguste Bartholdi and influenced his design of his magnum opus. He had originally planned to have the statue hold broken chains in her hand as a symbol of slave emancipation, but replaced them with the Book of Law. Right there. The Statue of Liberty does in fact include broken chains at her feet, but they are effectively hidden both by her robe and by the pedestal on which she stands. Like the Phrygian cap, therefore, the effective absence of the broken chains distanced the statue not only from slave emancipation, but from radical republicanism in general. Political dynamics in both France and the United States thus served to distance the Statue of Liberty from Republican egalitarianism, and in doing so gave it an important racial meaning. The resplendent white lady standing above New York Harbor turned her back on the racialized working masses of Europe and the increasingly marginalized blacks and other people of color in the United States. When Americans celebrated the inauguration of the Statue of Liberty in 1886, they celebrated a racialized vision of liberty. The original statue may not have been black, but the one they embraced was certainly white. Now, in the next section of the paper, I want to talk about the gender dynamics of the statue. As is well known, the United States met France's gift of the Statue of Liberty by funding and building a giant pedestal on which to place it. Funded by popular subscription launched by American newspaper magnate Joseph Pulitzer, the massive pedal and base rise 154 feet from the soil of what's now known as Liberty Island, slightly taller than the statue itself. The Lady of Liberty thus stands high above New York Harbor, lifting her torch to a height of over 300 feet and to this day dominating the maritime approach to America's largest city. This image of the woman on a pedestal corresponds to increasingly conservative images of gender and womanhood during the 19th century in America and throughout the world. We have already seen how the design of the Statue of Liberty represented a more conservative vision of Marianne, illustrating a shift in republicanism in both the United States and France. This shift corresponded to a broader transformation of the image and reality of women's lives during the 19th century, one historians have characterized as the rise of domesticity. Briefly stated, with the spread of industrial society and bourgeois culture, middle-class women found themselves removed from the world of paid labor and increasingly relegated to the home. While this new idea of femininity certainly did not reflect the lives of working women, the standard of female behavior and status increasingly characterized what it meant to be a woman in the modern age. The image of a woman on a pedestal closely corresponded to the new model of domesticity. It was the image of a woman prized and cherished, even venerated, but also controlled and fixed firmly in place. Many feminists thus saw in this image an attempt to masquerade the oppression of women in a gentle guise, praising them as symbols instead of recognizing them as human beings. They just rejected the arguments of men like Senator George Vest of Missouri, who in 1887 declared on the floor of the Senate that, quote, "It is said that suffrage is to be given to enlarge the sphere of women's influence. Mr. President, it would destroy her influence. It would take her down from that pedestal where she is today, influencing as a mother the minds of her offspring, influencing by her gentle and kindly caress the action of her husband toward the good and the pure." So, okay, a few more minutes. Okay, let me sort of wrap up with a discussion of immigration. For most Americans, the Statue of Liberty symbolizes above all the history of immigration to the United States, particularly the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period when nearly 14 million immigrants came almost entirely from Europe to America. I just want to make a couple points about this. First of all, many people in the late 19th century, many Americans saw the Statue of Liberty as not a symbol of welcome to immigration, but as a symbol of opposition to immigration. The movement known as Nativism in the late 19th and early 20th century, for example, adopted the idea the Statue of Liberty was representing, defending America from the dangerous horde. So here's an example of the Statue of Liberty shrinking away from these unkempt masses crowded around at her feet. Here's another one, the image of the immigrant as anarchist, bomb-throwing anarchist, threatening the Statue of Liberty and by extension, all of Americans. So I want to make a point here, which is basically, I think, really important. There was a sense in which the Statue of Liberty never stood for immigration. It became a symbol of immigration as precisely the time when immigration slowed in the late 1920s and 1930s. The slowing of the immigration was one factor. Another factor was the rise of a second generation. The children of immigrants who were born in the United States grew up speaking English and themselves embraced Americanism and were embraced by America as results of this product. By the First World War, you start to have lots of pictorial evidence linking immigration, the benefits of immigration, the Statue of Liberty, including the statue which was literally made up about 10,000 soldiers heading off to the war in France in 1918. By World War II, you have the ideal of the immigrant as the good immigrant. And here's a poster from the Detroit newspaper in 1941, celebrating immigrants as my children. Notice, by the way, the children are all European and white. So to conclude, let me just state that the Statue of Liberty amply reflects America's sort of conflicted nature over the relationship between race and freedom. Note that it was built in a place that ultimately came to celebrate European immigration. There has been no move to build similar statues on the Mexican border with the United States, on Angel Island in San Francisco, or in Miami to celebrate Cuban immigration. There is certainly no move to build a similar statue in Charleston, South Carolina, to celebrate or to commemorate the history of the Middle Passage. In fact, and this is my final remark, one of the things that the Statue of Liberty does in New York Harbor tends to obscure the fact that New York City was also one of America's great slave ports. So you have this image of liberty in New York Harbor that tends to suppress this image. This is the burning of a rebel slave in an uprising, in the aftermath of an uprising, a slave uprising in New York City in 1941. And it seems to me, ultimately, we have to come to terms with both of these images to realize the true significance of the Statue of Liberty and of freedom and race in general in American history. Thank you very much.